This episode of Crosscut Talks is supported by Alaska Airlines.
Hey, welcome to Crosscut Talks. I'm Mark Baumgarten, the managing editor at Crosscut, and today we're talking about American exceptionalism and whether or not it's fading. Our guest for this talk, Robert Gates, has a deeply informed idea of American exceptionalism. He was the director of the CIA under George H.W. Bush, and then later served as the Secretary of Defense from 2006 to 2011, working in both Republican and Democratic administrations. And he's continued to grapple with the place of America in the world since the end of his public life a decade ago. Last year, he wrote a book titled Exercise of Power: American Failures, Successes, and a New Path Forward in the Post-Cold War Era. If that biography isn't enough to tell you what Gates means when he says American exceptionalism, his answer to the first question from interviewer Mary Kay Magstead certainly does. Gates, kind of surprisingly, credits Madeleine Albright, the Clinton-era Secretary of State, with coining the term American exceptionalism. But with all respect to Mr. Gates, that just is not the case. American exceptionalism as a term has been around since the 40s, at least, and the idea of a kind of American exceptionalism has been around since before the founding of the country even. But Albright's American exceptionalism was a very specific one, built upon global supremacy in the post-Cold War era. That is what Gates is talking about here, in what is, at times, a pretty wonky conversation. Gates really gets into the weeds as he talks about American influence abroad, especially in China. It's a refreshingly in-depth take on a topic that's too often given a surface treatment. And the kind of subtext to this detailed breakdown is this: being exceptional is hard work. The apparatus that has kept America convening and influencing over recent decades, it's very, very complicated. And, of course, with that complexity comes a kind of fragility. And that's what this conversation is about. This talk and all the other conversations on the keynote track of the 2021 Crosscut Festival is sponsored by BECU, which would like to share the following message. BECU believes every forward thinker deserves added momentum, so for over 85 years they have offered financial services and support to the community. Members have access to local financial centers, over 30,000 ATMs through the co-op network, and online resources. BECU is a member-owned credit union that puts people over profit. Learn more at becu.org. Federally insured by NCUA. And I have just one more note on the recording. You'll hear some audio interference at the beginning of the interview, but I assure you that it clears up after Gates's first answer. All right, I hope you enjoyed the conversation. If you have any feedback, please send it to talks@crosscut.com. Okay, on with the show.
Secretary Gates, thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
We'll get to China in a moment, but let's start closer to home. What does American exceptionalism mean to you?
I think that American exceptionalism, and I think it was a phrase coined actually by Madeleine Albright, if I'm not mistaken, back in the early 90s. I think the gist of it is that America has a unique place in the world, and it is an exemplar of a free market economy and an example to the rest of the world. We have seen two different threads in American history of how that is put into practice. John Quincy Adams and others thought that we should be the city on the hill, the model for the rest of the world, and that we should try and set an example that others would emulate. The other side of that debate, if you will, was Woodrow Wilson, who believed that we ought to be aggressively out in the world trying to, as he put it, make the world safe for democracy, to actively be engaged in the rest of the world in promoting our values and in promoting democracy. I think that the one part of American exceptionalism that, in my view, remains relevant even in light of today's problems is that we still have a unique convening power. There is really no other country in the world that is trusted by most of the other countries in the world in terms of protecting what we would call the global spaces, the freedom of navigation, the internet, if you will, and other such domains. And our ability to get countries to come together to try to work on problems and to try and solve global problems. In a way, President Biden's convening of the global summit on climate change just a few days ago is an example of that. No one trusts the Russians to bring together a large number of other countries. No one trusts China to do that. And as suspicious of some countries as some countries are of the United States, the reality is we still have, I think, a unique convening power in the world in terms of trying to deal with global problems.
So then, what part of American exceptionalism is over, if in fact you think any of it is, or should be?
I don't think it's over, but I think it's challenged. And I think that in a way, the public comments that we have seen out of Xi Jinping of China and the Chinese foreign minister in Anchorage at the meeting are an example of the pushback that this country is getting, that our economic model is no longer one that others ought to follow. In the wake of the economic crisis in 2008, 2009, where we actually had to seek Chinese help to get out of that mess. But where it was created, a global economic crisis was created in this country. I think that our paralysis politically, and we've always had polarization in this country politically, but what is new is paralysis and our inability to tackle anything big and get it done, whether it's education or infrastructure or immigration and so on, and our domestic divisions. Not to mention the race issues that we have, the race problems that we have, and so on. And so the Chinese and others are saying, you're not an example either politically or economically that anyone else in the world ought to follow, and you're in no position to lecture the rest of the world in those arenas because of all the problems that you have. And I think that those are real challenges that we have. The question in terms of whether our being the indispensable nation is over, I think depends on how we come back economically, and also whether we can get past our political paralysis to tackle some of the real problems that we face here at home.
But how much of the challenge is in adjusting to a new situation are things that we can change at home, as opposed to a change in the global environment, in global realities, as different countries have become stronger economies, have changed their own expectations and their expectations of what role America should play. Perhaps moving toward a more multipolar world would be the preference of many such countries, rather than having America continue to be the premier power.
Well, I think a multipolar world is a given. That's just the reality, and we certainly are not going to be regarded under any circumstances as the model to follow for Xi Jinping or Vladimir Putin. But in terms of the rest of the world, I think that we still have that convening power, and they look to us for leadership in terms of trying to deal with global problems in a way they do not look to Russia or China. But it does begin here but getting to a better place does begin here at home. and addressing our domestic problems and and uh, and moving forward from where we are now politically, I think is critical. And I think that's why many of the problems we're trying to address include reinvestment in our own country and research and development and basic research, education, and so on. We have a lot of catching up to do here at home.
So I have to push back ever so gently because China, certainly when I lived in China and I attended, a summit for African leaders to come, dozens of them in 2006, and those sorts of summits, those sorts of meetings continue. There have been summits for the Belt and Road Initiative, 2 of them, that have brought in dozens of leaders. So with developing countries, China has developed a convening power. And has some street cred on the ground because of the investments that it's been making through its Belt and Road Initiative. It's a mixed record for sure, but there, as over the last 4 years, sort of American opinion toward or world opinion toward the United States has taken a bit of a beating, according to the Pew Global Surveys of Attitudes. China attitudes toward China until the last couple of years, last 2 or 3 years, have been reasonably positive in some of those places where China's investing.
Well, I think you've
what challenge do you think this poses for the United States?
I think you've actually framed it pretty well, and that is the power of the checkbook. The convening power of the checkbook is always powerful. And I think that Belt and Road is a challenge that we have to figure out how to deal with. And one of the things that we have going for us in that is that there are a lot of challenges associated with Belt and Road. The debt trap problem that a lot of developing countries are seeing, where they're getting sucked into, they are agreeing to projects that saddle them with a huge amount of debt to the Chinese. The Chinese require in virtually all of those contracts that they be with a Chinese construction company. They employ Chinese workers. They are not environmentally sustainable. And many of those projects may end up being white elephants. Now, I think that we've begun to figure out again how to compete with this. One of the problems that we've had is that after the end of the Cold War, and I write about this in the book, we dismantled all of the institutions that provide us with the non-military means of power. So we abolished, Congress abolished the United States Information Agency in 1998. When I left government in 1993, when I retired as CIA director, the Agency for International Development had 15,000 employees, dedicated people working in developing countries and often in very inhospitable circumstances. When I returned to government 13 years later as Secretary of Defense, AID had 3,000 people and they were mainly managing contractors. So China, ironically, has developed some of these non-military instruments of power that we've let wither. And until we reform those capabilities and fund them properly, we're not going to be able to compete with things like Belt and Road. So I think that China does present a challenge in this. We have made some progress. The Overseas Private Investment Corporation was replaced in the Trump administration by a new development infrastructure organization that doubled the capitalization of OPIC to $60 billion. And there's just been a recent move to increase that to $100 billion. But what I say in the book is that we really need to figure out how to do a public-private partnership here, and how can the American government incentivize U.S. companies to invest in projects in developing countries that actually benefit those countries, and not just the elites, but benefit the people in terms of jobs, in terms of production capabilities, and so on. And I think we have that capacity. We just haven't done it yet. But, as I say, I think China's convening power primarily is their is both positive and negative. On the positive side, it's the checkbook diplomacy represented by Belt and Road. It's also the fact that they use their economic power to disadvantage countries that cross them. So the South Koreans have paid a penalty for allowing the U.S. to put an air defense system in there. The people that sold us the land, the department store chain, has been shut down in China. When the Philippines challenged the Chinese stopped importing Philippine fruit. When the Nobel Committee awarded the Nobel Peace Prize to a Chinese dissident, the Chinese stopped buying Norwegian salmon. So they have this negative convening power in terms of pressuring countries very crudely to adapt their policies to please China. So I don't think that people do not willingly look to China for leadership in addressing global problems. They look to China for the benefit of the Belt and Road. They look to China for perhaps other benefits, but I think that it's a very different kind of convening power, a very different kind of power than the United States has had in the past.
Let me ask you, as a student of history, literally, you have your degrees, your bachelor's, your master's, and your PhD in history. As you look at the idea of American exceptionalism, the idea that America is different from other countries, that perhaps we, when the Cold War ended and we emerged as the premier power, that was just it. We wouldn't have to do the work anymore, and thus got rid of the U.S. Information Agency and so forth. What does history tell us about the rise and fall of powers, and what speeds that kind of a process? I mean, what are we not doing right now that we need to be doing, taking into account all the other things that are changing in the world, but to continue to play a meaningful leadership role in the world? You've talked about investment, but what besides that? What about, you've talked about several different instruments of non-military instruments of power that we've let wither. Like, what do you think is at the top of the list for what should be happening now that isn't?
Well, I think there are a number of things, and first of all, I would say that many of the problems that we have dealt with over the past 20 years internationally, and I would say, have derived from what I would refer to as either hubris or triumphalism after the end of the Cold War, and the belief that, with the fact that we had won the Cold War, the Soviet Union collapsed, and we were sort of sitting on top of the world in a position of power unparalleled, perhaps globally since the Roman Empire. And I think we felt we could change the world and make it more in our image. As Francis Fukuyama wrote, it was the end of history. The debate between authoritarianism and democracy and market economies was all over. And I think we've seen that's totally wrong, and history is still with us very much. But what we didn't really appreciate was that although the Cold War took place against the greatest arms race in the history of the world, there was actually a military standoff, and in the entirety of the Cold War, there were probably only fewer than 100 American combat deaths directly attributable to the Soviet Union. And where the Cold War was actually fought out was through surrogates in guerrilla wars and things like that, but especially in the non-military arenas. So technology, science, education, strategic communications, our alliances, all of these things were instruments of power that were used in an integrated way to combat the Soviet Union around the world and to to exacerbate their weaknesses. We had a variety of economic tools that we used, both positive and negative, against the Soviet Union and against people, and with respect to people in the Soviet orbit. So I would say that it's not just one thing that we have to redevelop, if you will, but a variety, and it starts with diplomacy. The State Department has been starved of resources for many years, and it has been weakened in many respects. But the answer is not just to throw more money at the State Department. It needs to be reformed. It needs to shed its bureaucratic character and culture. It needs to be more entrepreneurial. It needs to give more opportunities to younger people and not be such a stifling bureaucracy. Some of the most critical people, most critical of the State Department are some of our senior diplomats. We need to reinvigorate our foreign assistance programs. And President Bush did that along the lines of the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which talked about accountability and making sure that there was local buy-in to projects and so on. We need strategic communications. In the early 2000s, Hu Jintao invested $7 billion to create a Chinese global strategic communications capability. We dismantled USIA, as I indicated earlier. So we've allowed, particularly under the Trump administration, we took one of our greatest assets, non-military assets, our alliances, and put that in jeopardy. And it will take a long time, I think, to get the level of confidence back among our allies that we are a reliable partner. So there's a variety of things that we need to do in the non-military arena that need investment. And the truth of the matter is, compared to the costs of our military, these non-military assets or these non-military instruments of power are relatively inexpensive. When Condi Rice was Secretary of State, she and I would banter back and forth about the fact that if you took all the foreign service officers in the American foreign services there are, it would not be enough people to crew a single aircraft carrier. And so we need to understand that these non-military instruments, first of all, were critically important in our success in the Cold War, but they are absolutely essential in the contest that we're in with China. Because China, unlike the Soviet Union, is a multidimensional power. The Soviet Union basically was a military power that had oil and gas. China is a far more economically sophisticated, economically successful, economically integrated into the rest of the world country than the Soviet Union ever dreamed of being. And so if we're going to actually be able to compete effectively with China, both directly and around the world, we're going to have to reshape and reform and reinvest in these non-military instruments of power.
China is challenging the U.S. or would like to compete with the U.S. not just economically and politically and in terms of the non-military instruments of power, but potentially also militarily. Some of China's Belt and Road Initiative investments, many of them, are in ports in strategic locations or along coastlines, including near and around the South China Sea, but also in Pakistan's port of Gwadar, in Sri Lanka's Hambantota, and in Djibouti, where China has its first overseas military base. How concerned are you about the possibility of U.S. and the United States and China clashing militarily, and where do you think it might happen if it does?
I think both countries really understand how disastrous a military confrontation between the two of them would be, and my greatest worry is that a conflict would occur through miscalculation or an incident that spirals out of control. And of course, the most likely arena for that is in the South China Sea, where our military forces and their military forces are bumping up against each other almost on a daily basis, and where both sides are being pretty forward-leaning in the deployment of their particularly their naval assets, but also air forces. The Chinese have created a blue water navy. You've mentioned places where they actually are probably going to have, where they either probably will or already have a naval facility, particularly in Djibouti. But they're also looking for a naval facility, a Navy base on the west coast of Africa, which would give them access to the Atlantic Ocean. So all of a sudden, we're not talking about the Pacific and the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. We're talking about the Atlantic. And so I think this is very worrisome. And they're cranking out ships at an unbelievable rate. Xi Jinping just commissioned 3 new warships all at once just a few days ago. So I think this is a worry. They're not a global military power at this point. Maybe they will be. They certainly have devoted a lot of investment to their Navy and to their Air Force and their missile capabilities. But I think where they are particularly a challenge for the United States is in the South China Sea, is in the Pacific, particularly west of the first line of islands, west of Japan and Taiwan and the Philippines and so on. And there they outnumber us significantly. They have about 370 Navy ships there, and we have something on the order of 70 or 75. Now, we have allies who have ships, and so that number isn't as one-sided as it sounds, because the Japanese, the Australians, the Philippines, and others have navies as well. But it is clearly the area where they have dramatically improved their military capabilities. I think that the risk of a conflict clearly right now is greatest with respect to Taiwan. But I think that at least for the near term and maybe the medium term, the risk of a direct Chinese assault or invasion of Taiwan is actually pretty low. There are a lot of alternative means of putting pressure on Taiwan available to the Chinese that are short of war and short of the potential for a confrontation and even a major war with the United States over Taiwan. I worry, for example, about what I would call a nibbling strategy, where the Chinese might seize 1 or 2 Taiwanese islands that are actually quite close to the coast of China and therefore militarily not particularly a big challenge. And I doubt that the Taiwanese or the U.S. would go to war to retake those islands, but Xi Jinping would have made a point. I think there are also a variety of economic and other kinds of tools that the Chinese can bring to bear against Taiwan, but the South China Sea is the place where the risk of an inadvertent confrontation could escalate, and we don't have any of the agreements with the Chinese that we negotiated with the Soviets in terms of maintaining control of inadvertent incidents that could escalate. With the Soviets, we had the Incidents at Sea agreement, which provided a set of procedures that you would follow and that both countries would follow if there were a clash or a confrontation between our ships or submarines. And we don't have anything like that with the Chinese. We don't have a hotline with the Chinese. So that's a worry for me. So the military piece of it is significant.
We'll be back with more after this message.
Ready to take your travels to the next level? Alaska Airlines is committed to providing a higher standard of safety and cleanliness throughout your journey. From mask requirements and touch-free options to HEPA filters on board and everything in between. Plus, their award-winning loyalty program, Mileage Plan, makes it easy to earn and redeem miles wherever you go, including destinations worldwide, thanks to their One World Alliance membership. If you're ready to land a low fare, next-level care, and the best experience in the air, book now at alaskaair.com.
Now, we have a few questions that have come in from you, and we are going to go to some of those. Secretary Gates, one of the questions is, can you talk about why you think you were able to straddle two administrations from two different parties? Do you think that could happen again now, given the current political climate?
So one of the questions I got a lot was, how could you possibly work for two presidents as different as George W. Bush and Barack Obama? And I would just smile and say, well, you forget I worked for Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan. The fact is, Bush and Obama were the 7th and 8th presidents, respectively, that I worked for. And I just figured out fairly early in my career how to navigate a path that basically focused on national security and kept out of politics. And I think that was central. One of my great regrets when I retired as Secretary of Defense that I voiced publicly at the time was that at that point, and that was 2011, I was the last senior American national security official who had worked for both Democrats and Republicans. And I think that's a real concern in our national security establishment today.
So another question, can we count on China to help us bring along countries like Russia to take bold action on climate change? What alliances for good can we hope to work with China on? How can we cooperate together?
I think that there is a menu of things we could work with China on. Secretary of State Blinken has sort of described the U.S. our approach to the relationship with China as falling into three baskets: areas where we potentially can cooperate, areas where we will compete, and areas where we will be adversaries. And I think there are a number of areas that where we potentially could work together with the Chinese. I think getting a handle on Iran's nuclear program is one of them. The Korean nuclear program is another. Climate change is another. When I was secretary, and admittedly those were in a little easier days in terms of our relationship with China, we did some naval exercises with China, working together on potential humanitarian assistance, disaster relief, sort of along the lines of helping if there's a tsunami in Asia and so on. So I think there are some areas of potential cooperation. What we don't know, going back to Blinken's three baskets, is whether the Chinese see the relationship in that way, and whether Xi Jinping is willing to sort of think about it in those same terms. So, and frankly, I think whether it's climate change or anything else, I don't think the Chinese or anybody else is going to be able to bring the Russians along, if you will, to cooperate. Russia under Putin is basically a disruptive power, particularly with respect to the United States and the Western democracies. And on climate change, the truth of the matter is, if you look at the commitments that were made at the summit that President Biden hosted, the Chinese basically said, we'll kind of get there along the lines of when we said we would. We'll begin to get a handle on it by 2030 or something. But the fact is, the Chinese are now putting out more emissions than all of the other OECD countries put together. Russia made no new commitments at the climate meeting. So I'm not sure either power, frankly, is particularly interested in making any serious moves toward dealing with the climate problem.
Okay, another question is, can the United States do anything to respond effectively to China's actions in Hong Kong, which is legally part of the People's Republic of China since 1997?
Well, only reactively. It's very, I think that the chances of reversing what has happened in Hong Kong are somewhere between slim and none. And so we can be punitive about it, and there have been some sanctions taken and some measures taken against the privileges that were accorded Hong Kong, particularly economically, by the United States government. But But at this point, it seems to me the only recourse that we have is a punitive one. There is very little chance of reversing what has happened in Hong Kong, in my view.
Hmm. So this is shifting a little away from China and just looking into the future. Do you think do you see countries in Africa or South America or other places we're not looking that closely that we might consider as true emerging powers that you expect to play an outsized role going forward in this century?
Well, I think that the most obvious one along those lines is India. India is going to already plays a very important role, and I think will have an increasingly important role in the world. The problem, one of the sad realities of history is that in the late 19th century, Argentina was one of the top 10 countries in the world in terms of economic power. But thanks to economic politics, it now faces many challenges, as does Brazil, and in all honesty, also Mexico at this point, under President Obrador. So I other than India, is hard for me to see another country emerging in the next, say, decade that will has the potential to play the kind of global role that I think India is likely to play.
And the U.S. is working with India, Japan, and Australia in the Quad, cooperating in various ways. Do you see ways that the U.S. should be thinking about cooperating with other emerging powers, some of the ones that you mentioned, not just in the next decade, but beyond that going forward?
Well, I think that that our development assistance programs are very much in our interest, and people faulted the last president for an America First policy. The truth is, every president's responsibility is to look out for American interests first. That's their primary job. The question is how you do that. And frankly, it seems to me development programs, particularly if going back to my earlier comments about a public-private partnership in terms of investment in developing countries, it's in our interest for those economies to prosper and potentially be markets for the United States, and for us to increase our trade with them. The problem is the country that's doing the best job of that is, in fact, China. China is the primary trading partner of a majority of countries in the world, probably twice as many countries as we are the primary trading partner. And if we're going to compete economically with China, we need to look more broadly than just Western Europe or certain countries in Asia and so on. And so I think it's in our own long-term interest to do what we can to foster economic development in these countries. And I would add political reform. The thing is, we have to understand they're not going to behave they're not going to structure themselves the way we would have them structure themselves. We have to be more understanding and tolerant of different cultures and different approaches to governance other than the one that we have. And actually, going back to the beginning of our conversation, and as the Chinese would point out, ours is not such a hot model for people to work right now to look to anyway.
Right. So they would make the argument, we have an all of government, all of society approach to what we're doing. We share a goal. We want China to be great again in the world. We have, Chinese rejuvenation. And you look at, from the Chinese perspective, and I heard this many times when I was living in China, you look at kind of what the mess appears to be in the United States when it comes to elections and democracy. And they say, we clearly have the better model. Now, it hasn't necessarily sold as a package to other countries, even with the shift to authoritarianism in some other places. But China's rather unique in having a competent technocracy within an authoritarian state. How much do you?
Yeah,
Go
no,
ahead.
go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, please.
No, I was just going to say, to coin a phrase, the dustbin of history is full of empires that underestimated the United States and its resilience. So frankly, I'm still betting on us for the long term, but there's no question that we're going through a bad patch. And the truth is, the Chinese model is attractive, particularly the Chinese economic and political model is attractive, especially to would-be or existing authoritarians. It's a peculiar kind of model.
There are a number of questions about Chinese investments in the U.S., like what's being bought up. There were a lot of investments being made about 5, 6, 7 years ago. They've kind of tapered off since then. Another question is, if China cut the U.S. off economically, would the United States collapse? What do you think about Trump and now Biden's tariffs on China? Feel free to answer whichever part of that you'd like.
Well, I think that our basic approach to the Chinese should be reciprocity. The same privileges that we have allowed them here, they ought to allow American companies, whether it's intellectual property or whether it's investment rules or joint ventures or a variety of things. The truth is, particularly in the last couple of years, and the Biden administration is actually ramping this up, there is going to be a lot more scrutiny going forward of Chinese companies trying to invest in the United States, and particularly anything having to do with technology and high technology. The strengthening of the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. has been strengthened by statute by the Congress. And so I think that it will be a far more selective process now going forward in terms of Chinese investment here, particularly in sensitive industries. With respect to the trade conflict, the truth is, I think tariffs mainly penalize the consumers and not particularly the Chinese government. I don't think that's the best way for us to exercise our economic leverage with respect to China. I think if all trade between the United States and China were cut off, I think it's more likely the Chinese would have a bigger problem than the United States. And the final thing I would say on economics, this is where our own national interests are served by our alliances. When we're having our economic debates with China and in an economic negotiation with China over the rules of the road, just think, right in the last administration, it was the Chinese on one side of the table and us on the other side of the table. But just think how much more powerful our position would be is if on our side of the table, in addition to us, there was Japan and Australia and the EU and India, and all of us basically saying these reciprocity rules are the way this is going to have to happen in the future. Our negotiating position would be so much stronger if we mobilized our allies in an approach that economically benefited everybody.
That's a great note to end on. Secretary Gates, thanks again for being here.
My pleasure.
And that's it for this week's episode. Thanks to Robert and Mary Kay for the talk. And thanks also to the folks in the audience who asked questions. If you'd like to be one of those audience members for a future Crosscut event, go to crosscut.com/events. This episode of Crosscut Talks was engineered by Chi Lee. The live recording was engineered by Rusty Bacall and Victoria Ralph, and the event was produced by Jake Newman and Andrea O'Meara. Ann Krisnovich and Mo Klaub managed our audience engagement. If you'd like to subscribe to Crosscut Talks, you can do just that on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you listen. For the latest political, environmental, and culture news from the Pacific Northwest, visit crosscut.com. And if you would like to support the work that we do at Crosscut, whether it's the live events we host every month or the in-depth reporting we deliver every day, go to crosscut.com/donate. Crosscut Talks is a product of Cascade Public Media. I'm Mark Baumgarten. We'll be back soon with another conversation.